Welcome to this video. Today we'll be looking at one of the most anticipated openings, the London system. It goes as follows: pawn to d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, pawn to d5, and bishop f4. This move, bishop f4, is the one that symbolizes the London. And it has been a very hated opening for many black players because it's really hard to find something easy and good against this opening. And a lot of games can become really boring. The play is really easy for white. White usually plays pawn to e3, pawn to c3, knight to d2, bishop to d3, and the game is simple. I have also taught many of my students to play this line when they're starting to getting into chess, simply because it's a very easy way to learn to put the pieces on good squares. It can also become a disease, because once you get used to play the London, when you will have to play other openings, it can become quite hard. Anyways, let's look at my suggestion what to play with black. After bishop f4, I would recommend to play pawn to c5. After c5, white has some different ways of playing. If white takes this pawn, we will play pawn to e6, simply intending to recapture the pawn on c5. If white plays a move like e3, we will take the pawn and all is good. Instead, if white tries to defend this pawn with a move like b4, it will be dubious, because we will play pawn to a5, intending to break up this pawn structure. Now white cannot play a move like a3, then we will simply take, and there is a pin on the a8 rook to the a1 rook, and black is winning. So after a5, white can play a move like c3, intending after a takes b4, c takes b4 to recapture. After this, black can play a move like b6, very simple, again breaking the pawn structure. Let's say white takes this pawn, black can now take this pawn on b4 with a check, and next move we will take the pawn on b6, and black has a healthy pawn in the center. Another way of black can play is knight c6, which is actually the Indian move, but it's a bit more complicated, and that's why I would recommend b6. So d takes c5, e6, black is already fine, so this will not be recommended for white. White can also try to support his pawn with c3, intending to meet takes with c takes d4 with a solid game. We don't really want to do that, so instead we'll play knight to c6. And the idea here is that if white now takes our pawn, we will again play pawn to e6. If white now supports the c5 pawn, because we are threatening now to take bishop takes c5, he can play a move like pawn to b4. Black can play a5, again attempting to destroy this pawn structure. So if white now plays a move like knight d4, intending to trade these knights, here follows a really cool line. So we can take on b4, knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, pawn takes b4, and knight g4. The idea is that we are coming up with queen to f6, hitting the rook on a1, and attacking indirectly the pawn on f2. And I'll just show you a cool line, which goes knight d2, queen f6, hitting this bishop. White will move back, bishop g3, and here we have a very strong aggressive move, pawn to h5, intending to push h4. White can now not play a move like f3, because then we will put the knight on e3, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop, and the knight is very strong here. So after h5, white could play a move like h3, and it looks like he's about to take our knight, but we're just in time to win the game. You can play pawn to h4, and when white takes this knight, we will take hg3, and now it looks like, okay, we're losing a rook on h8, he can take our rook, but then we have g takes f2, checkmate. The white king can't do anything. Also, we can take with the queen if we want. Anyways, this was just a side note. After knight c6, pawn takes c5 and e6, as we just saw. After a5, knight d4 is not the best move. Instead, white can try to play pawn to b5, hitting the knight on c6, and then we will play knight to e7, intending next move to put the knight on g6, put a knight on e4, and simply pressure the pawn on c5, and black has a great game. So after knight c6, the main way for white to play is to play e3, but this will transpose to another position after queen to b6, and we will get to this a bit later. So the main way for white to play here is to play pawn to e3, again intending to recapture on d4 if we will take now c takes d4. So this we will not do. Instead we will play knight c6 just as before, and again if he takes the pawn on c5, we will play e6, again recapturing the pawn on c5. Note that after b4 here, we can simply take the pawn, and black is winning. So after this move, also there is knight to c3, intending to play in the Yubava London spirit, where he can play a move like knight b5 next. Here we have the very strong bishop to g4. The idea being, if he now plays the knight to b5, intending to play knight c7 check, we're just in time to play rook c8, covering this c7 square, and black is better. So after bishop g4, white can again try to take this pawn on c5. Again, it will be met by pawn to e6, and the rest of this line you can check out on leeches, but black is already better here. So knight c3 is not to be scared of. Instead, white has also tried to play a move like bishop to e2, but now it's actually time for us to take this pawn on d4. The reason being that this bishop is actually rather passive here on e2. It would much rather be on d3. So we will take c takes d4, and after e takes d4, we will play bishop to f5, intending to put the pawn on e6, and black has a very solid game. Simply no problems. So now we're getting back to this position, which also arose after c3. Let me just show you quickly. c3, knight c6, e3. This is the same position as after e3, knight c6, and c3. So here, this used to be the old main line of the London, but it has fallen a bit out of fashion, mainly because of this move queen to b6, hitting this pawn on b2. Here white has tried different ways to defend this pawn with the queen, because he cannot really allow it. If he plays a move like bishop b2, we will take the pawn, hitting the rook, and in general we just want a pawn. We can also retreat the queen. So white has to defend this pawn on b2 somehow, and white has tried in many different ways. One way is to play queen to c1, but this is a rather passive square for the queen. It would much rather be on some other square. So now we will take on d4. White can perhaps take with the e pawn. Then again we'll play the bishop on f5, intending to put the rook on c8 and the pawn on e6. So after c takes d4, white can also try to play c takes d4, but then we will go after this bishop here on f4. Usually it's a great thing to try to aim for the bishop pair. So a move like knight h5, hitting the bishop, and the bishop is in some trouble, because if he plays bishop to g5, we will play h6, the bishop goes here, we can play g5, and at some point we will take this bishop with the knight. So after knight h5, white doesn't really have a great way to play. If he plays a move like bishop to e5, we can now play pawn to f6, again intending to take this bishop. Note that you don't want to take here with the knight on c6 on e5, because then white will usually take d takes e5, and the knight on h5 is stranded. A knight on the rim is dim. So after knight h5, black simply has a great game. So queen c1 is nothing to be afraid of. One kind of tricky line is if white plays the move queen c2, because here a lot of players have mistakenly played the move bishop to f5, which is not so great, because okay, if white takes here, we can take on b2, intending to take the rook, after a move like e6, and that's great. But after bishop to f5, white will play the intermediate move d takes c5, and if we take the white queen, he will take our queen on b6. And after a move like a takes b6, white can play knight a3, hitting the bishop, and we have a stupid double pawn here. So for this reason, bishop f5 is not really to be recommended after queen c2. Instead, I will again play this knight h5 move, hitting this bishop on f4. After knight h5, white doesn't want to allow me to take his bishop, so he can play for example, to g5, then we'll play h6, bishop h4 and g5, again trying to get the bishop. For this reason, white has tried to play the bishop to e5. And this is quite a tactical way of playing. Black will play now f6, just as before, hitting the bishop on e5. White will take now on c5, hitting the queen on c6. We will recapture with the queen. And after a move like bishop d4, hitting our queen, we will move the queen to a5. And now the game gets very concrete. Already knowing until here is a great start. But black is threatening to play e5, attacking the bishop on d4. So white has to do something. That's why white can play a move like b4. We will play the queen to c7. Again, intending to push pawn to e5 at some point. And also we have a nasty threat right now. For example, now if white plays bishop to e2, we can perhaps play knight takes b4. The idea being that if he takes back, the queen is hanging on c2. So this should not be allowed by white. That's why now the game gets really crazy. You can check out the rest of the analysis, but it will go something like pawn to c4, black will play e5, hitting the bishop, and after c takes d5, a lot of pieces are hanging, but black is not worse. Anyways, you can check this out. But if you find this line a bit too complicated, also I want to say that it's perfectly fine to play a move like g6 here as well, simply intending to either develop the bishop to g7 and at some point the bishop to f5, and now also the bishop is protected here on f5, so nothing to worry about. So this was queen c2, but now let's take a look at the main move here, which is queen b3. The idea is that if black now takes this queen, white will recapture, and he's opened up his rook on a1 with a great game. For this reason, we will now try to force him to take our queen, and that's why we'll play the move c5 to c4, hitting the queen on b3. And now, if he takes our queen, we are the ones who get the open a-file. And this is quite a relief, because after a move like, let's say, knight a3, intending to go to b5, we will play bishop to f5, for example, and black has a great game here. For example, if white now tries knight to b5, intending to play in the Yubaba London spirit with going knight to c7, we can play rook to a5, hitting the knight on b5, and if knight goes to c7, it's simply an empty threat. We can play, for example, king to d7, and the knight will be in trouble. So after bishop f5, some games have been played. I just want to show a cool exchange sacrifice, which I've looked at. If white now hits our bishop with knight h4, we can retreat our bishop. White goes back, intending to repeat the position. Here we can now play rook to a5, intending at some point maybe to push b5 later in the game. White will try to attack our pawn, bishop c7, intending to take. And now black will play very aggressively. We'll play knight to e4, a great square for the knight. And if white now takes our pawn on b6, we can take rook takes a3. And it looks a bit crazy. We're giving up a rook for a knight. But the point is that after b takes a3, pawn to a6, this pawn on c4 is very strong. And black will very soon win the pawn on a3 and the pawn on c3. And this will create a very strong passed pawn on c4. And for this reason, black is actually better in this position. So I've been hoping to play this but unfortunately no one really plays like this with white anymore. But it's important to know the idea still. It can easily happen. So queen takes b6 is generally considered a bad move. For this reason, most white players, they go queen to c2, keeping an eye on the b2 pawn. And now comes this great trick where you can, it looks like you hang a bishop, bishop goes to f5, hitting the queen, and it looks like white can just take this bishop. What's the problem? But now we will take the pawn on b2, and the rook on a1 is stuck. And here I just want to show one very important point. After bishop e2, it's important not to take the rook immediately. If we now take this rook, white will retreat with the queen to c1, and our queen on a1 is trapped. It simply has no squares. Next move, white will castle and try to trap the queen, win the queen with moving the knight at some point. For this reason, we simply have to start with the move pawn to e6, hitting the queen on f5, and the queen cannot retreat to the queen side. It doesn't have any squares. Queen c2, we can take it. Queen c2, we will take. So after this, a move like queen h3, now we're ready to take the rook, and we can simply retreat the queen with taking the pawn on a2. So queen takes f5 is losing for white. For this reason, there have been many games with the queen to c1, keeping the eye on the b2 pawn. And after this, black will play, for example, the move h6. Black actually has many moves here. He can play knight h5 or e6. All these moves are fine, but h6 is the easiest one, because now we can simply retreat the bishop here if white goes knight h4. We'll just go back to h7, and we are doing great. The bishop is eyeing the whole game. So after a move like h6, the game could continue like knight d2. We will play pawn to e6. White will develop his bishop, bishop e2. We will play bishop to e7. Both players will likely castle. And now white will aim to push b3, because he cannot really deal with this very strong pawn on c4. So he wants to relieve the tension. b3, we will take this pawn, because otherwise white is threatening to take our pawn, which we don't want. So we will take, white will take, and we can play a move like a5, stopping any kind of b2, b3, b4 ideas. And black is doing fine here. If white plays another plan here, which is to play bishop to d1, intending to trade the bishops on c2, I will recommend to play rook to c8. After bishop to c2, I will simply not even take this bishop. I will move the queen to d8. The idea is quite sophisticated. If he now takes our bishop, we will recapture, and we have a lot of control over this very vital e4 square. And actually black is simply better here. We're going to continue with moves like b5 and a5 and expand on the queen side. So this was the line with c3 and queen b6, and there is nothing to be afraid of here. It's simply a nice game for black if you know the theory. For this reason, white players have turned to the move Knight BD2. And this is the move that made the London popular again. Because white, as we just talked about, he wasn't happy here with c3 and queen b6. But then they found the very concrete lines with Knight d2, and it revived the London. So after this move, black should play e6. One other line is to play queen b6, just as before, but here the lines are slightly different. Now white will take on c5, and if we recapture here, our queen will get into some trouble, and white can play for a quick development, like even moves like c4, and sometimes when the rook goes to c1, black can get into trouble. So instead there is a lot of discussion going around the line queen takes b2, but here there is simply too much theory, and for most players I would not recommend using so much time, just to have something against the London. It is simply impractical, in my opinion. Instead, I will recommend to play pawn to e6, keeping an eye on the c5 pawn. And here white has some different options. For example, if he plays a move like bishop d3, we will now play pawn to c4, and black has to leave the b1 to h7 diagonal with bishop e2. We will play pawn to b5 and again expand on the queen side. Also, white can play a move like bishop e2, but this is nothing great because now we'll play queen b6 in a much better version. The bishop is not doing so great here on e2, and if white now takes on c5, we can recapture with our bishop. So for this reason, bishop e2 is nothing to fear. There is another line. Actually, I was a bit surprised when I looked at it recently that it has some venom. Bishop goes to b5 to pin the knight on c6. Here it's very logical to me to play bishop to d7 to destroy the pin. And after castling, play a move like bishop e7, intending to castle our king to the king side. So here, if white plays a move like c3, we will castle our king. And now the bishop feels a bit misplaced here on b5. So at some point he has to retreat the bishop, for example to d3. But then we will now go after his other bishop with knight to h5, hitting the bishop on f4, and black is fine here. So instead, the most critical move is for him to take the pawn on c5. The idea is that now black used the move to play bishop f8 to e7. Now he will take on c5, forcing us to use another move to recapture this pawn. And I looked at different lines here. One line was to play a move like bishop d3, intending to play c4. After this we'll castle and c4. And black actually still has to play some good moves here to equalize the game. But it's manageable. We will take on c4. White will take on c4 with the knight. We will play now knight b4, because the knight is very badly placed on c6. It's in the way, sort of. We would like to have the rook on c8, and that's why we'll play knight b4. After this, usually white doesn't want to give us the bishop pair, so he will play a move like bishop to e2. And after bishop b5, I think black is doing okay here. So after bishop takes c5, white can also try to move bishop to e2, again intending c4. And now he doesn't have to deal with this knight b4 jumps attacking his bishop. So after this, we will again castle our king. And after pawn to c4, I recommend to play queen e7, following up with moves like rook fd8 or e5 at the right moment. But check out the analysis for more details. So also I was looking at what happens if white plays very concretely. If he plays a move like c4 here. Then I found that black can play pawn to a6, hitting this bishop on b5. And if white now retreats the bishop to a4, for example, now we're ready to take here on c4. The point being, if white now recaptures, knight takes c4, we have b5, forking the bishop, forking the knight, and black is winning. So after a6, white can also try to take our knight. After bishop takes bishop, knight goes to b3, hitting our bishop on c5. We have to move it, bishop e7 for example, and white will play knight b4, hitting our bishop on c6. After this, black can castle the king, and I think black is okay here. There's not a big deal to worry about. If he takes our bishop, we'll recapture, and the next move will put the queen on b6, and all is fine. So this was bishop b5. A bit of annoying move, but nothing to worry much about. I think black is doing okay there. So now let's turn to the main line. This is pawn to c3, and this is the starting position of the new kind of London. And here I will recommend a somewhat simple line, at least a very concrete one. it is to take the pawn on d4. And this forces white to act. If he takes with the knight, this is no good. We will play bishop to d6, and now we simply have more pawns in the center. We have a pawn on d5, while he has pawns on e3 and c3, which is great for us. White can also try to take with the c pawn, but after this we will now play the queen to b6. And it's very important to note that the knight on d2 is misplaced here. It would much rather be on c3. But as you already played knight d2, this is not possible. So here white can play a move like queen b3, like before, but here we will actually take the queen. And here's a difference. If he now recaptures with the pawn, now this double pawn is isolated, and it's no longer such a big strength to get it. Of course, white still gets the open a file, which is a plus for him, but this weakness on b3 and b2 can be a big headache later in the game. So white can also try to take with the knight, but after knight h5, we will again go after the bishop on f4, and black is fine here. So after queen b6, it's also possible for white to protect the pawn in other ways than queen b3. For example, he can play a move like rook to b1, and after this we will again go after the bishop. We'll play knight to h5, hitting the bishop on f4, and if he moves it back on g3, we can take it, nothing to worry about. He can also try to play bishop to e5, then we'll play f6, and again he has to move back. If he plays a move like bishop to g5, we will play like before, pawn to h6, bishop to h4, pawn to g5, and after bishop g3, we can again take it sooner or later. But white can also try to play knight to e5, very concrete, making use of the fact that the knight on h5 is undefended. In this line, black can take, and after a move like queen takes h5 here, we will take on h4, and now it also gets a bit complicated, but after queen takes e5 and rook g8, black is doing fine here. He has pressure on g2, next move he will play bishop to d7, and it's an interesting game. So this was c takes d4, but let's get to the main line. It's e takes d4. White now wants to play the bishop to d3 and castle his king. But we will not allow him. We will now play very concretely. We will play knight to h5, hitting this bishop on f4. After knight h5, white has to do something about this. So one option is to play a move like bishop to e5, but then we'll play f6, again hitting the bishop. And after bishop g3, for example, we'll play g6, and all is fine. At some point, when we're ready, we will take the bishop and play with the bishop pair. White can also try to play bishop g3, and I actually faced this in a game of mine. I took the bishop and I played g6, intending bishop g7. Actually, I would recommend an even better move here is to wait with g6 and first play bishop d7. And once white have played a move like bishop d3, now it's time to play g6 and put the bishop here. The reason is that after g6, white has a move bishop b5, which is a bit annoying, putting some pressure here. So it's just a minor detail, but I had one game here against another Grandmaster, which I managed to win. So you can check it out on Lichess. After knight h5, white also has other options. One is to play bishop g5. Here we will again play pawn to f6. It's very important to always try to chase this bishop. This is one of the key ideas of the line, trying to get the bishop pair. So after f6, if white now plays the tricky move, knight to e5, intending to take this knight on h5 with the queen, we will protect it with the pawn, and now white is facing an unfortunate situation as I'm hitting both the bishop and the knight, so he'll probably have to take my knight, and I will take back the pawn, and I'm getting a lot of pawns in the center. So after f6, white can also try a move like bishop to h4, and then we will play bishop to d6, intending to short castle. At some point we can put the knight on f4. For example, if he plays a move like bishop to d3, you can play knight to f4, hitting the pawn on g2, hitting the bishop on d3, and black is better here. So after f6, white can also try to retreat the bishop to e3, and then we will play bishop to d6. Again, we have ideas of knight to f4. If he plays a move like bishop d3, knight f4, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn, and black is better, or at least fine. And after bishop d6, white can also try to limit this knight by playing pawn to g3, taking the f4 square from the knight. And after this, I would recommend to castle. And here is actually a cool line. If white plays a move like bishop to g2, we can now play f5, intending to put the pawn on f4. For example, if he castles, we have f4, and now the bishop is in trouble, so he probably has to take the pawn, and we'll take with the knight, and we have a very strong knight on f4. So after f5, also if white plays the move knight to e5, hitting again the knight on h5 with the queen, we can again play f4, and the bishop on e3 is in a lot of trouble. And here it gets quite complicated, but let's say we take on h5, we will take this bishop here on e3, and if he recaptures, we can take this knight in different ways. But for example, we can take here, and he will take with the pawn, and we can put out the bishop here, and black is doing excellent here because of the very strong bishop on c5. So anyways, this was if he plays the bishop to g5 here. Now we will get to the main line, and that is to play bishop e3. This is also what most players play. And the idea now is to develop our bishop to d6, again targeting the f4 square. This comes to show after a move like bishop to d3, where we can play again knight f4, hitting again the bishop and the pawn on g2. Here, if white now takes, we'll recapture with our bishop, and after something like castling, and rook e1, we will play bishop d7, and we have the bishop pair, and the position should be around equal. So after this, it's also possible for white again to play a move like g3, but here we will castle our king, and if white plays a move like bishop d3, for example, it's important that here we shouldn't play f5. This is quite important, because now the bishop is targeting the h7 pawn. Instead, we should simply retreat the knight to f6, and after a castle, we will play the pawn to h6, and in this position we will play with a waiting strategy. We simply want him to move the knight away from f3. For example, if we play a move like rook to e8, and he plays knight h4, now we're ready to push in the center, because he moved away the knight. Now we can play e5, and we will get initiative in the center. Anyways, let's now get to the main line. Most players here with white, they play knight to e5. And here I will suggest a somewhat peculiar move, which is to play knight back to f6. And it looks a bit strange. We used the move to go to h5, and now we're retreating. But we have some very good reason to do it. Because right now the knight on e5 is unprotected, and white has to do something about it. One way could be to play a move like bishop to b5, putting pressure on the knight on c6, but here we have a very cool way. We can simply leave the pawn hanging. We will castle the king, and if white now takes with the knight, take with the pawn, take with the bishop, we can play rook b8, and we have a lot of pressure on the white position. For example, if white plays now pawn to b4, we have bishop to a6, and white is not allowed to castle. So after bishop b5 and castle, white also have other ways of playing. If he takes now with the bishop, pawn takes bishop, knight takes c6. We will also play queen b6, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn on b2, and black is better. If white plays a move like f4, we will play queen to b6, hitting the bishop on b5, and also looking at some tricks of using the fact that the queen on b6 is indirectly targeting the bishop on e3. For example, if bishop to d3, we can take bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5. And if he recaptures, we have queen takes e3, hitting the king, hitting the pawn, and we won a pawn. So after bishop to b5 and castle, black is doing fine here. So white has to do something else. If he plays a move like bishop f4, we will play queen c7, and again we're doing okay. But let's now take a look at the most logical way for white to continue here, and that is to play pawn to f4, defending the knight on e5. Here the tactical idea of black is to play queen to b6, hitting the pawn on b2, and again creating this access to the bishop on e3 indirectly after taking on e5. For example, if white plays a move like rook b1, we can now again take on e5, take, knight takes e5, and again use the pin of the queen to the bishop. So after queen b6, white has tried one tricky move here, which is queen c1, but now we can take on e5. If white takes back, we will take on e5 with the bishop. White has some tricky line here, which is to play knight to c4, hitting the bishop, hitting the queen. And at first it looks really weird. Why can't we just take? But this is a grave mistake, because then he will take on e5, hitting our queen, hitting the knight on f6, and black is losing. For this reason here we have to play like Le Quang, where he plays bishop to g3, check, and after taking we will recapture here on c4 and resolve the problems now, because now he can no longer take on e5, hitting the queen. So there has been one game here, Le Quang Liem against with the black pieces against, I think it was Ivanisevic, something like that. And after bishop takes c4, black played queen c6, hitting the bishop on c4 and the pawn on g2, and eventually black won the game. So after queen to b6, white has to do something about the pawn on b2, and white decided to play white can decide to play queen b3 here. The idea is that again, if we take now on b3, white will capture with the pawn, again opening the a file. So after queen b3, black can play knight to g8. And this is one of the main ideas of my suggestion. The idea is to kick away this knight on e5, making life tough for white. So after this, if white now takes our queen, we will recapture with the pawn, again playing pawn to f6, putting the knight on e7 with a great game. Instead, white can also try to play a move like bishop to d3, and after knight e7, we will eventually play pawn to f6, and black is doing fine here. So now let's take a look at the last important line of this analysis. And this was something I faced in the European Championships in 2021 against Grandmaster. a Swedish Grandmaster. He played knight to f3. After this, I played the move queen to c7, which I still think is the best way for black to play. And then he sacrificed the pawn here, bishop to d3. And during the time I wasn't completely aware of how strong, or at least how dangerous this line can be if you don't know about it. But after checking it more thoroughly, I find that black is doing okay. So we will now take on e5, pawn takes e5, bishop takes e5, white will take our bishop, queen takes e5, and castle. And the idea is for white to play a very positional game. He wants to put the bishop on d4 and have the bishops eyeing my king side. Still, the best move for me is to castle, and after a move like bishop to d4, play queen h5. The idea is that if we now trade the queens, then I will be doing fine. I'm a pawn up, he has the bishop pair, but a pawn should be more than fine to equalize the game. If he takes, I will simply recapture, and black should be okay here. Instead, he played the move queen to e1. And here I found an improvement over the game. In the game I played rook to e8, and he took my knight. I took back and played f4, and it got very complicated. Instead, I will recommend to play the move b6. And this is very useful. Sometimes we want to put the knight on d7 to c5. Other times we want to put the bishop on b7. And it's a great waiting move. If now white has many options after b6. For example, if he plays a move like f4, it's very important here to sacrifice back the pawn. We can now play knight to e4. If he takes this knight, we will take back, queen takes, and play rook b8. Next move we'll play bishop to b7, and black has no problems here because of the opposite colored bishops, and the king will be very safe. So f4 is probably not going to cut it. If white now tries to play like Grandelius, we have an improved version. After takes, pawn to f4, we can now play king to h8. And if white plays rook f3, intending to go to h3, we're just in time here with rook g8. Note that white cannot play rook h3 because we can simply take it, and because of the pin, he cannot recapture the queen. And if white moves the king to h1, we can play pawn to e5, and we are again stopping his idea of playing rook to h3. For this reason, white can try some different other moves, the main one probably being pawn to b4, stopping the knight from going to c5 and just trying to get some space on the queen side. But here I have a very interesting idea, also approved by the engine, is to play knight to g4, threatening checkmate in 1. White has to play the move h3, and we will maneuver back the knight to h6. The idea is that we want to put it on f5, and it's not so easy for white to stop this idea. For example, if he plays a move like a4, knight f5, we are attempting to take the bishop on d4. If white now plays the move g4, hoping to fork the queen and the knight, we can simply take this pawn on h3. Hitting the pawn on g4, hitting the bishop on d3, and black is winning. Instead, after knight f5, I think black is doing fine here. We are over the worst, and we activated the knight, and I actually think I would be completely fine with playing this position if I had it again. Also, white can try a move like f4, but then we'll play the knight to f5 again. Note that g4 is still not a threat because we will take the pawn, hitting the bishop on d3. So I think that after b6, if black knows this, he should be fine. And also remember, it's very rare, this line. There have been maybe just 10 games or something in my database where white has played this line. So it's much more common to face the move f4 after where queen b6 is a very nice solution for black. I just want to quickly show some move order things as well, because white can also start with playing the move bishop f4 at move 2. Here I will recommend to play pawn to d5, and if white plays a move like e3, I will play e6. Next few moves we'll play c5 and knight c6, and it's very likely that we will reach the same position as in the game. Knight d2 for example, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and after c3 we reached our position where we can play pawn takes d4. So this was more or less it for the London. I hope you liked the idea, and you can check out the rest of the analysis on Lichess, and just enjoy. See you around.